Good evening, all. It is good to have you join us. As we wait for folks to filter in, I want to remind you that there's a Q&A function that you can use to enter questions at any point in our session together, and then we will try to get to those at the end. There's also the chat function where you can chat with either just the panelists or you can chat with the panelists and all the other attendees. So those are your two ways to sort of interact with us and with one another. I do want to apologize for anyone who has had difficulty accessing this Zoom. I don't know why, but occasionally Zoom just decides to stop sending the daily or the weekly reminders a day beforehand. So we have worked on it and none of the things have worked. So I hope that if you're watching this afterwards because you haven't been able to access it, just go ahead and email faithformation@stpaulshouston.org and we will try to get you connected with a working link. The link should stay the same every week, but in case you are one who cleans out your inbox often, we can get you set up. So apologies for that, and hopefully we can all get connected in the future. So with that, I can open us with a word of prayer. Oh God, open our hearts and minds by the power of your Holy Spirit, so that as your word is read and proclaimed, we may hear with joy what you say to us this day. Amen.
Amen. So, Karen, I don't know about you, but we now are coming towards the end to our journey with Kohelet and Ecclesiastes. And I'm reminded of like orientation week of seminary. I had a professor and he gets up to preach at this at the same pulpit that was in the chapel, using this orientation, and he starts by saying, I hope during seminary you fall in love. And I was not married at the time, but a lot of people are married in seminary because a lot of people are older, second career and that sort of thing. And so everyone's like, I hope you fall in love. And he said, I want you to fall in love with someone who's dead. And he goes on to say, I want you to spend your late nights in the library, like reading deeply, like taking in the wisdom of people who have like come long before you in the Christian faith or in the faith following God. And, this is like a truly like unique experience. You have the opportunity to kind of like delve deeply into the thinking of a person. And I was thinking about this for Kohelet, that love him or hate him, this deep dive into Ecclesiastes is could be an opportunity to fall in love with someone, insofar as the more you know someone, the more of an opportunity you have to fall in love with them. But like there's something really wonderful about these deep dives and our ability to drink in their thinking. So this is all to say, I hope you're enjoying our deep dives, drinking in Ecclesiastes and Kohelet's thinking. Karen, I think you have some structural kind of layouts for where we're going for tonight's.
Absolutely. So just to give you sort of a lay of the land, the reading for this evening separates out into 4 main sections-ish. So we will cover those 4 sections sort of thematically. We will not do a ton of intricate verse work. This section, when I first read this particular section, I did not have any cohesive thoughts about it because it is, it feels really disjointed. In the NRSV that I have here, chapter 10, the heading is Miscellaneous Observations, and it feels like it. It goes much deeper than that, but that's one of the reasons we're not going to do as much verse work, and we're going to be working more with the themes that Kohelet presents us. So we'll cover each of those 4 sections of the verses that we have for this evening, And then we'll offer some closing thoughts. So it'll be pretty straightforward this evening. So the 4 sections are also can be divided in half. So we have section 1 and section 2. And section 1 is one that can be divided into several sections that are introduced with the words "I have observed." So the common thread through all of the sections is the notion that everything in life is precarious. And it's just our general lack of knowledge that provides the framework for this literary unit. So at the beginning of the section, Kohelet emphasizes that we don't know our time, like humans don't know our time. And at the end of the section, they reiterate that we really don't know what will happen. So the first 2 verses in 11 and 12 talk a lot about how despite what we may think, the intellectual don't actually have an edge on anyone else in terms of luck. It doesn't mean that people who invest in education and wisdom and who are really intellectually astute, it doesn't mean that they're destined to fail. It also doesn't mean that they don't have an edge, but it's that nothing is guaranteed. So there's no assurance of security for either someone who's intellectually gifted or someone who's physically able or someone who's well positioned.
Yeah, and I think this, like Kohelet's observation, I particularly, he mentions the race doesn't always go to the swift, nor the battle to the mighty, nor food to the wise. But I think the wealth to the intelligent, or favor to the knowledgeable, wealth to the intelligent. I think about how much in sometimes in our technology, entrepreneurial obsession in our culture with kind of Silicon Valley startup culture, there can be a real hyper focus on like the success stories, so that we might become really enthralled with who Steve Jobs was, for example. And we'll kind of lift him up as a singularly brilliant innovator who was able to do these amazing things because he was just this, incredible science nerd guy, but he wasn't like the engineer doing the thing. He was actually just kind of a great marketer in a way, and he knew how to package something really, really well. He was really smart, but there's a lot of smart people that aren't super rich, and I think there's a way in which we have a bias towards the successful people, and we kind of get this thinking, maybe explicitly, sometimes just implicitly, that like we're wealthy because we worked hard enough and we earned it. And the people who are super successful got that way because they worked hard or they're brilliant. When the reality is like a lot of people are just in the right place at the right time. And they say the right thing to the right person. They have the idea in the classroom where there's another person where they can link up and work together and it's a great team, or they're in a situation where they just thrive, where their personality works. There's always happenstance to all of this. And so Kohelet is kind of like recognizing, hey, like most of us are not going to be the person who's this like Steve Jobsy type person. But like, one, that's okay, because like most of the time, all of those like little tiny things that need to happen just don't happen by random chance. So don't think it's like, you're not the problem if you don't become Steve Jobs. Like easily Steve Jobs could have not been Steve Jobs. Like you're okay. You're not the problem if you're not as wildly successful as your 3rd grade teacher said you could be, or your mom said you could be, or your professor said you could be, or whatever person in your life early on in your life said that you should be this, or you could be this high. And it feels like life hasn't yet lived up to that expectation. Or, there's the, if you were the gifted kid who doesn't feel like they are living up to the expectations people put on them. Or if you just feel like a normal kid, that's okay. Most of us are going to be the normal kid, right? At the end of the day. So I think like Kohelet is kind of placing things in their right positioning.
Mhm. And he really doubles down on it. In this section, my commentator writes about how we sort of get this anxiety-induced overthinking edition of Kohelet, where they really catastrophize a little bit to illustrate the chances of life and death. And as we were going over this earlier, Paul said, you might be projecting a little bit there with the catastrophizing, because I am excellent at that art. But I do think that it's here in the text as well. Kohelet really emphasizes that accidents happen. And no one can predict when something tragic may happen that'll put an end to your ability to enjoy life or achieve your goals or fulfill what could have been, as Paul was talking about, which often we think of as this great potential that we have. No one knows when anything could happen. No one knows when death may come. And that is the great incident that no one can escape, as he has really hammered in the previous chapters. He makes this point, Kohelet makes this point that everyone is like fish and birds, just sort of wandering about innocently. And any one of us can be caught without any distinction to species, or if we're mature, or even should be caught at that time. But really emphasizes the chance, the fleetingness in this section by talking about all of the things that can go wrong.
And there's a way in which we might see Kohelet. I guess I'm getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. The next section, we kind of talk about how it's good to be wise.
Mhm.
Like we're gonna, as this goes on, we're gonna see more and more about how it's good to be wise. And we might imagine that Kohelet's a little bit like changing his tune a little bit. He was saying that searching after wisdom was Havel, that it was chasing after the wind, but now he's seeming to like say, now wait a second, wisdom is good to have. I would kind of say, well, and I will say some biblical commentators have gone on to claim, well, this means that this is a different writer. This is someone coming in. This is someone who has a different perspective that they've tacked on to the end of what is the original Kohelet. But I think Kohelet is trying to argue that wisdom has its place, that you shouldn't get too overwhelmed with chasing after it or think that it's always going to mean the best things are going to happen to you, because even if you are the super wise person, it won't always. So he's trying to say, look, wisdom is good to have, but it's not going to save your skin all the time, and it's not going to make everything work. But that doesn't mean it's not good to have.
You are kind of jumping ahead a little bit into the
sorry.
next couple verses. We hear that story in 9:13, but just to pull it back to close up these couple of verses, 11 and 12, the other side of his naming this lack of security, right? Accidents happen, everything's bonkers. The other side of naming that sort of insecurity is that every day is a gift. The future is uncertain. We don't know what will happen. We have today, and today is a gift. I think it's really easy to fall into the cycle of thinking that I will be happy when, and like insert the next life thing here, like when I get the promotion, when I get a raise, when I graduate, when I marry, when I finally live in the house that I love, when I have kids, when the kids move out, when I retire. I'll be happy when these things happen. And it may be that these events do catalyze a wonderful happiness. I have found great happiness in marriage far more than life previous to that relationship. But Kohelet warns us to not only have focus, to not only have motivation, and to not only really live for a future happiness, and to instead enjoy this life, this day, at every opportunity. And one note, just a moment, one note here that I think of, like we're right in the middle of Lent, and the pastor in me says, okay, but what about redemption? What about the hope of future resurrection? Like this is future happiness that we kind of do count on. And we'll return to that at the end of the lesson. Okay, I'm finished.
Well, I was just gonna finish up my statements. Kind of a point that I had written down that I wanted to say is about that. Like, if you didn't fulfill your potential, my commentator she had a funny kind of point that like, if you didn't succeed like others around you, don't lose heart, because it could have been that they succeeded because they cheated or they manipulated the outcomes. So maybe it's just that you're more ethical than the people around you. So
Certainly. Do you want to move on to the next section now?
that sounds great.
Okay, well, we've covered half of it. But this next section is this story in which Kohelet is sort of an omniscient narrator, talking about this tiny town that's in dire straits. And as the narrator, Kohelet knows that the town might have been saved if only this wise commoner had been given the opportunity to do so. And it's this tiny town, it's in an emergency. And so it's pretty apparent that it's not that they didn't know about the person or that they were saying something and offering wisdom, but they chose not to listen to it because they weren't prominent. They were described just sort of as a low status person. So here, Paul talked about this just a minute ago, we get a couple different contradicting statements about wisdom. Kohelet quotes the more traditional saying that we can find in Proverbs in chapter 21, that wisdom is better than might. And then they follow up right afterwards by saying, but wisdom is despised. And my commentator says, this is a true but observation. So it may generally be true that wisdom is better than might, but reality really relativizes this traditional saying. So even though verse 17 is pretty much the direct opposite of verse 16 and what they're communicating, and it's allegedly Kohelet saying both of them, my commentator thinks that this contradiction is deliberate and that it's not two different people, but that what we're reading here is the gap or the contradiction between what the principle is and what the reality is. So what the rule is and what the exception is.
And the verse 17, 9:17, the calm words of the wise are better heeded than the racket caused by a ruler among fools. I think it's kind of funny to think, I have heard it is a very human problem that we love, that we naturally listen to the person who can shout the loudest.
Yeah.
And as someone who has a voice that like I can shout very loudly if I wanted to, I just have like a voice that can carry. Like it's a helpful reminder that also when you're listening to people, you should be aware if someone is shouting, because it suggests that perhaps that person does not have a better way to express themselves, or maybe what they're saying is not actually something that you should be listening to. Because if they didn't shout, if they weren't shouting, like they wouldn't have a need to shout if what they're saying actually had merit in its own right. And so there's like a way in which, like, it's maybe helpful if you're in a meeting or if you're in a group and there is someone who talks loudly, or if there is the kind of person that is going to like talk over something like that. Maybe shift your gaze, your ears over to the person who might say only a few words. Maybe that person's voice needs to be uplifted in that moment. That just feels like a wise universal thing that like we often miss out of our own ignorance, the person who actually has the wise words. Mm-hmm. I'm all again getting ahead of myself with that.
Well, but as a caveat to that, which is not actually related to this passage, but just responding to what you were saying, I would argue that that is maybe true or good advice to heed if folks are of a similar station, or if the people shouting might be more powerful or more prominent than you. But often folks who are less prominent, shouting is sometimes the only recourse they have, because they tried the quiet thing and it didn't work. And
and that is more faithful to Kohelet, because he says the racket caused by the ruler. He's specifically naming the powerful people who shout are the people who we need to be cautious of. Yeah, because obviously there are some people who are not heard just because they're powerless in society.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, sad for that town. Like, they could have listened to that guy, but they didn't.
Are you ready to move on
Let's
to
keep.
the chapter 10, 5 to 15?
Yes, let's keep on moving.
Okay, cool.
Well, I think there's also down to 10:3. Fools lack all sense even when they walk down the street. They show everyone that they are fools. Different translations will do it a little different, but this one way of translating it is that they walk down the street calling everyone a fool. And so there's this idea that my translator points out, or my commentator points out, that a fool is someone who thinks everybody else is a fool. So, like, I feel like I've heard this person who they think that they uniquely have figured it all out. And, maybe we, some of us have kind of like fallen into that trap where we start to think that we have like a unique set of wisdom. That, like, truly a wise person can kind of recognize wisdom inherent in everybody. That, like, maybe some people are not very wise, but they might have something wise to say every now and again. And, like, a wise person is someone who can find those little bits of wisdom in everybody. And so there's a foolish way in which you think everybody else is a fool as well. I think that's a fun little tidbit. On to the next section.
In really this whole section that we're covering this evening, Kohelet paints a picture of a society in turmoil. In this next section, they talk about the Hasakel, which is like a simpleton. Some commentators say idiot. I don't really love that word, but it's a simpleton set in high places. So CLCO, who I'm using as my commentator, writes that Kohelet means that those who are not competent in any way are the ones who are promoted. So we think of the ruler in the past verses in 17 and 18, or those who lack wisdom but are quite arrogant, like Paul was saying, the fool who thinks everyone else is a fool, just real mediocre person, but real arrogant about it. And my commentator argues that this picture of the society in turmoil is the picture of the socioeconomic conditions of their own world, of Kohelet's world. In his world, we've covered this a lot in the past weeks. The government couldn't be trusted to rule efficiently because they were losing control. There was significant turnover in the bureaucracy as those who are really not competent are promoted to high offices. The economy is unstable. There seems to be no order in society or in the cosmos. And everyone seems sort of resigned to this pessimism of it all. And Kohelet uses this section to describe some micro level dangers and some macro level dangers, and then comes to a couple conclusions about, like, so what, to try to bring us out of the pessimism. So he describes this series of occupational hazards, essentially. He talks about if you're building a low wall with a bunch of rocks, you're not using any mortar, you're just rearranging the rocks to build a new wall. Eventually, if you do that enough times, there will be a snake in the wall and it may bite you. So he describes that as one occupational hazard. And really, he just communicates that accidents happen in all walks of life. So then at the macro level, there are these dangers when society's in transition, whether it's social or economic or political, and emphasizes that the wise aren't guaranteed wealth or livelihood. Again, the race doesn't belong to the swift. The victory doesn't belong to the valiant. And then at the micro level, there are just dangers in every mundane experience of our day, and that risks are part of life. Everything in life is subject to chance. So from these observations and these descriptions, Kohelet draws two conclusions, and Paul alluded to these earlier. So the first is that there are problems in which wisdom can be applied, practical wisdom can be applied, and the problems can be remedied so that you might not be able to prevent accidents, but the risk is significantly reduced. So it's like, in our very current day, in the pandemic, it's like wearing a mask or having gatherings in the open air. It is not 100%. Nothing is risk-free, but it does help. So then the second conclusion that Kohelet draws is that there are also problems where any amount of application of wisdom guarantees no desired outcome. So alludes to this verbosity of the wisdom teachers. We talk about Kohelet and the wisdom tradition. And these wisdom teachers are always ready. They're these people who have it all figured out, like Paul was saying. They're always ready to offer some catchy advice to handle every situation that comes your way. Right now on YouTube, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of videos about like 5 quick ways to do this thing right, and you'll get X, Y, or Z result. But Kohelet's sort of pushing him back on all of these little catchy advice pitches that claim to solve every situation in a guaranteed way.
Well, and I have to say, like, I'm all for like the YouTube videos that are like, this is how you install a radiator in a 2007 Toyota Yaris. And like this guy is like, so I got my daughter's, radiator and I'm going to change it. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about like, how can I get health, wealth, the like big stuff of life that is not a formula. But yet somehow we have like so many people who think if you just follow this formula, like because I do missions, I'm always kind of paying attention to all of discussion in society about poverty and kind of social issues. And like, there's this kind of thinking in development studies where you talk about the pathway to not being poor is to get your high school diploma, get a full-time job, and get married in that order. And then don't have kids until you've been married. And he's kind of pointing out that like, wait a second, like that doesn't always work because sometimes you lose your job, sometimes you get divorced, or sometimes there's issues in that relationship, or sometimes there's accidental pregnancies that are out that that you maybe weren't taught about how to prevent, or something like that. Like there's so many ways in which that formula doesn't really work in development studies. And anyway, so like life is not a formula to be figured out all the time. It's like sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than that.
So again, really this first section is just placing wisdom in its place, not as the thing that will save us, but as a good thing that still doesn't guarantee anything.
And my commentator, kind of in this section about the work hazards, she kind of points out that a similar kind of thinking to your point, Karen, that some of this is advice of just like, how do you live wisely? But she points out that how do you live wisely in a world where everyone is kind of forced to be on their own? So
Right.
like, absent a well-functioning oversight group like OSHA to make sure you're safe at work, like you have to make sure the tools you use are the right ones, they're sharpened, they're taken care of. And we might think about like in the time of Kohelet, if you were a laborer, you had your own tools and you could use them and take care of them, and you could make sure that happened. But like we have an Amazon warehouse like a mile down the road from our house. Like if you're an Amazon worker, you're like in this massive factory with all of these like machines flying by. You have no control over the programming of those machines, the maintenance of those machines. Like you really have to trust that the programmer, the maintenance worker, all of these people, just the safety oversight stuff, like you really have to trust that that's in place, because you can't be all in on yourself. Like, so like we might think about like if Kohelet was in our day, would he maybe contend for like a different way of thinking, because like for many laborers in like a factory setting in the last since and really industrialization, we had like there needed to be things like worker protections put in place because you can't sharpen your own tool. And so that's going to be an interesting way to think about scripture, because of just how much sociologically things have changed and how work works out. So I think the last thing for this section, Karen, that I had is my commentator, Temez, talks about 10:15. The hard work of fools tires them out because they don't even know the way to town. It's like they don't know the way to town, and that's how their work tires them out. Anyway, so she quotes a commentator who says that not knowing the way to town is like a metaphor for gaining wealth. So he translates it as, what bothers the fool most is not knowing how to get rich. And so there's like this way in which like we might, when we're acting foolishly, we might kind of get back to what you were talking about, where we think like the 5 simple rules will get us rich, and then we'll get really upset when it doesn't work. And Kohelet is kind of like, didn't you know from the beginning that like trying to accumulate wealth was wind chasing, was Havel? So anyway, I thought that was a fun little, they don't even know the way to town.
Yeah. Kohelet has this focus on both money and power, just the whole thing. And we talk about this every so often throughout this study, that this is really directed at a specific audience, folks who find themselves sort of in the middle, who have something to gain, who have something to lose, who are really preoccupied with finances. So a couple times in this, even just this session tonight, we've talked about success in terms of financial success. That does not represent our actual views, but just the framework that we're working with and that Kohelet is working with for his audience. So I felt like a disclaimer was necessary there. But he continues in this second half. Are you ready to move on to the second half, Paul?
Yeah, the second half starting in 10:16 through 20.
Yeah. So in the second half, he continues talking about the political realm and the economic realm and how there are risks in both. So this second half, though, is sort of marked by a shift in mood, and it shifts from the author's reflections to this direct address to the audience that we're just talking about. So now that Kohelet has spent a long time saying a lot of different things about the inevitability of risk, Kohelet follows up with some practical advice on how to live with it, which follows that conclusion that I was talking about from the last section, that there are ways to apply wisdom to the risky world. Like, yes, everything is bonkers, but here's how to cope.
And in this section, I think a thing that kind of it tickles me a little bit is he personifies the land for a moment. To talk about too bad, my translation says, too bad for you, land whose king is a boy, and happy is the land whose king is dignified. And it kind of made me think of, if you are, responsible over a large piece of land like a king would have been, it behooves you to have good agricultural practices like crop rotation. I don't know if that had been invented back then. I don't know when crop rotation was invented, but there are wise ways to care for land, and there are unwise ways of land. If you try to plant cotton for 20 seasons straight, you're going to have the Dust Bowl. There are ways to take care of the land, and it'll take care of you. You'll keep it healthy. And then there was ways to try to just, if you always are trying to take from the land, it's not going to have any more to give to you. So there's a recognition of the land as a living, kind of breathing thing that we are totally we desperately rely on. And being a city slicker type like myself, born and raised in the big city kind of idea, as I'm sure many of you are, is like we are so ignorant, painfully ignorant about the importance of the land and the role that the land has and how we need to take care of the land and how like soil is really important. A healthy soil is really important to the entire health of the world and all humans and animals and flora and fauna and all that business. But yeah, I thought that was it was an interesting point, and that I'll just since I'm talking, Karen, I'll just wrap up my little point here. In that section, there's also a discussion of alcohol.
Oh yeah.
In 17. They have the right, the happy is the land whose king is dignified and whose princes feast at the right time for energy and not for drunkenness. Like there's this like way in which Kohelet is talking about the right time to drink. And it really got me thinking about the ways in which some of what Kohelet does here is he's talking about community ways of like policing behavior. And sometimes like community policing of behavior can be really negative insofar as like you're encouraged through like bad peer pressure. Like maybe you got told growing up, like peer pressure is a bad thing. But maybe here peer pressure can act as a good thing because it's a way in which the community can say, hey, like we don't drink in the morning. We drink in social gatherings. And like, you know, we don't want people to be alcoholics. Like we don't want people to hide drinking. We want people to drink at unwise times. Like there are certain times for celebrating. You need to understand that. And like, hey, we don't want people to abuse alcohol and, you know, fall into that pattern. So this is the way in which we're going to do that. And it made me think of, so I minored in German in college, and I spent a year in Germany, and I learned a couple fun phrases that were kind of used as kind of community policing against bad drinking habits. And one phrase is "Nur ein Schwein trinkt allein," only a pig drinks alone. And it was this kind of like reminder, like, hey, like, don't sit in your room and drink. Like there was this kind of like way in which they made sure that people didn't fall into like the dark places that one could fall into. And then there's in Bayerisch, the dialect in Bavaria, there's this term Gratler, and the Gratler is the guy who sits, as it was explained to me, is the guy who sits at the back of the bar drinking by himself in a dimly lit section. And it's like someone you desperately do not want to be like, because he is sad, lonely, and mean. And I think the kind of implication in there is that like that he's probably also, you know, having an issue with his overconsumption of alcohol. But it was kind of used as like a slur. Like if you were misbehaving, like friends would say like, oh, du Kratler. And it was this like way of community policing. So I think it's interesting to think about like a little bit about this section is kind of like throwing out like, these are our community guidelines. Like, don't forget. And I think that's an interesting social function to me that I don't know, fascinated me in this section. So
when we were reading over this as a teaching team to prepare for our session tonight, I brought up the previous wisdom that Kohelet offered of enjoying today. So I said, well, why not feast in the morning? Why not get drunk in the morning if you're supposed to enjoy today? And the conclusion we reached was that day drinking produces no winners. It's always something you regret. And so that's the wisdom that Kohelet is offering here as well. This is a fun section in a lot of different ways, but one of the things that I really noticed here in his description of the risk in the political realm is this framing of references to the political elite, where Kohelet begins with both explicit and implicit criticisms of the political establishment. This is not new. But Kohelet ends this like short section here with a warning to not criticize the powerful. And then there are also just like a couple verses in the middle that feel somewhat unrelated. And my commentator brings this up as well and says that these criticisms are aimed at the rulers and aristocrats, but they're presented in such a way that you could deny any accusation of their political intent. So Kohelet has clearly mastered the art of saying something without saying anything. And the critiques of the political establishment are disguised as these sort of disinterested wisdom teachings that are a little bit out of touch. And that's where those seemingly unconnected verses in the middle come in, 10, 18, and 19. It's just more political commentary in the guise of these neutral proverbs. So there is quite a bit of reading in between the lines in this section, which is sort of prompted. It's not like we're just like, oh, well, this doesn't make sense. Let's read more into it. But it's prompted by these direct contradictions that Kohelet makes. So it's like a signal to the reader or to the hearer, to the audience, that there is more here, but maybe one is not free to speak of it, as Kohelet admonishes the audience.
And kind of like maybe one example of that, Karen, is so in 10:19, feasts are made for laughter, wine cheers the living, and money answers everything is how my translation renders it. And they're like, money answers everything. That doesn't sound like Kohelet at all. Well, one way it can be translated is money is everyone's answer. And maybe that's his coy way of saying like y'all think if you just had more money, things would get better. For some people, like that is demonstrably the case. If you had more money, you could pay for baby formula and diapers, for rent, for your medication, for the surgery, whatever it is, right? Like there are ways in which like you need a certain amount of money, but then like there are people who like absolutely have enough. Like definitely they have enough for the basics of life, but for some reason they think like, oh, you know, I'm unhappy now. If I just had a little bit more money, I would feel better. If I had a little bit better house, if I had a little bit better car, if I, that we can kind of trap ourselves. And so I think to your point, Karen, that Kohelet can kind of sneak that one in on us. And because that is something that wealthy people need to hear, because poor people don't need that lesson, because because wealth will, like, more money will help them. They just, because they have so many material needs. But if you're at a certain point where you have enough and you're taken care of, you maybe need to have that idea inception in your head a little bit, like, oh man, I do think money answers my problems, or, you know, money answers all my issues. So.
And I was looking for the translation that my commentator offers for 18 and 19. And this translation reads, through slothfulness, the beamwork collapses. Through slackness of hands, the house crumbles. For merriment, food is prepared. Also wine that gladdens the living. And money preoccupies everyone. So that is a very similar translation that is compatible with what your commentator offers as well.
Yeah. So thank you to Randy and Jeanette Zurcher for reminding of that section that maybe seems to kind of go against Kohelet, Kohelet's earlier discussion of wealth. So are you ready to move on to the last section, Karen?
Sure. And I actually don't have a lot for this section. It's about economic planning. There are other views, I think, that your commentator has about what this says about generosity. So I invite you to share that.
Yeah. So there many commentators see, like, so 1 and 2, send your bread out on the water, because in the course of time you may find it again. Give a portion to 7 people, even to 8. You don't know what disaster may come upon the land. So some people, one way to read this and this whole section is, you know, scatter your seed kind of thing, is like spread, like diversify your bonds, you know, make sure, don't put everything in one basket, hedge your bets. it's okay to take risks, but make sure, yeah. My commentator says like, yeah, that could be one way to read it, but you could also equally look at it in as a admonishment to share when you come to wealth. That because in one way, like you don't know if you're gonna have some later, so you might as well enjoy it now. That's a kind of what he's going for, but actually, it's not just like you don't know if you're gonna have the wealth later. So don't just blow it on yourself, blow it on everybody around you. And like, by the way, I'm not saying what like you need to count on it, but you should know if you are generous, you'll get a reputation. And if you fall on hard times, people will help you out. Remember when, good old faithful Mary was, so kind to us back when we lost our house or whatever, we really should make sure we, fix her fence that fell down from the tornado. I don't know. I'm just making up a story, but that like there's a way in which it comes back to you if you are generous. He's not saying that this is like should be in your insurance plan. But like, this is like, maybe if you have a lot of money, you should think about, even just kind of as a practical matter, be generous with it. Mm-hmm. This kind of plays out in the real world. When I was in seminary, one of my internships was I spent a summer in the country of Malawi with the United Methodist Church, and learning from the leaders there in that conference. And the conference has only been around for 35 years or so. And so many of the leaders are indigenous leaders, but they still have a few people who come in from the United States and the global connection in the United Methodist Church that like teach seminary courses. And I got to befriend one of the missionaries and his family who is from Germany, and he was there to teach in the seminary and also do training courses amongst the lay leadership. And he moved into Zomba, Malawi, and there's a Zomba theological school. And Zomba was the capital when the British were the colonial rulers of Malawi. And they liked it because it was the coolest place. Malawi can get very hot. It was the coolest place in the country because it was just a little bit up in elevation. And this missionary's house that just like was owned by the United Methodist Church used to be a British colonial official's house. And so it was pretty nice. And it wasn't massive. It was like a little one-story, but it had a large garden. And he immediately came in, and like 5 or 6 people came to him and said, the last guy employed us as your gardener, cook, maid, childcare person, like all guard, like all of these people are like, hey, like, are you going to employ us? Because like the last guy was our meal ticket. And so he kind of was like, I guess I can't say no, but I feel weird being a pastor and having all of these people who are like my servants. What do I do with it? And so one of the kind of tricky things is he's about to go back to Germany, which, for all missionaries in the United Methodist Church, if you're a missionary, you have to come home and you basically go from church to church and you kind of tell what you've been up to and then ask for donations to continue to support your missionary work. So he goes back to Germany, and it takes about 2 months to do this. I don't remember the pattern for the global missions, but it's like 2 months that you're back in your home country or in your home area. And they were like, okay, we better pay everybody up front some of this money. And they were like, no, do not pay us up front, because if people find out that we have extra money, they're going to want like us to give it all away. And basically what he kind of figured out is like, there's this like really incredible ethic of sharing. But then the reverse of that is like, if you temporarily come into a little bit more money, the community doesn't let you keep it. You kind of are so expected to be generous that you are ostracized if you're not generous with any extra money you have. like any amount of savings then becomes a target for people to demand things from you. So maybe there's like an insidious nature to this, but there's that communal idea of taking care of one another was like deeply embedded into the community ethic in this. I don't know if I can universalize it, but at least this person's part of Zomba Malawi that this expectation was. So for people who are in very, very poor, perhaps then this is your insurance plan. Be generous when you have money, and then make sure that, you know, when other people get money, that you can get some too from them. So yeah, so there's some practical, interesting ways in which we might think about the sharing lessons at the end here.
So this whole section is a lot of random advice. They really are miscellaneous observations. Some of it's questionable. We have gone over a lot of it just sort of at face value to give you some explanations of what it could mean or what it could be. And for our moderator, we are winding down. So if folks want to use this time to put questions in the Q&A, you are welcome to, as we offer some closing thoughts. So this whole section really grants a big so what. One of the big themes that we had talked about from the beginning is that you cannot count only on wisdom. And remember, Kohelet speaking out of the wisdom tradition and saying that wisdom is not anything. Wisdom doesn't mean anything without humility. We recall the story of the wise commoner in the town. The town had access to wisdom, but not the humility to listen to it. So wisdom's nothing without humility. And even then, there's so much chance and change in the world that we can't prepare for. So I think that the question that Kohelet wants us to ponder, after all of these examples and stories and admonitions, is where do you place your trust? Where do you place your trust? We've talked about placing your trust in wisdom. We've talked about placing trust in your intellectual merit. We've talked about placing trust in your bonds or your economic status, placing trust in the power that you have or the current governmental structure that benefits you in some way. And Kohelet wants to know and wants us to really critically think, where are we placing our trust? Kohelet is speaking to all of these who have placed their trust in all of these different places because, again, they have something to gain and they have something to lose. These are the in the middle folks. And so the writer goes to these astonishing lengths of very confusing miscellaneous observations to remind the audience of the instability and the risk in the economic and political world, not to discourage and not to only say that everything is pointless, but to put things in their appropriate place, to help the audience, to help us to place appropriate trust in these systems. And I think that this is a primary lesson of Havel, this recurring theme that we have throughout the book, to have humility about the world and about our place in it.
And, you know, I certainly talked a lot about homelessness at St. Paul's, but I hope you'll trust me when I say I see in St. Paul's a deep, deep compassion around our siblings in the world who experience homelessness, and there are so many around our campus that I think you, St. Paul's, you see people who experience homelessness. Some of you may have experienced homelessness yourself, and so you understand what it's like. And but I say that to say I went to Glide, formerly a United Methodist church that has a very robust ministry with people experiencing homelessness. I mean, they have like a 6-story, little office building that's basically all dedicated to ministry with and for people experiencing homelessness. And while I was there, learning from them and getting to volunteer with them, one employee there who was working with my group kind of gave us a talk. And one of the things she said was, it's really helpful to always remember when I'm doing this work that we're all one step away from being homeless ourselves. And at the time, it seemed wrong because I knew that I was not one step away. And I knew that the one step from homelessness for me was like very close to societal collapse. Like if all society fell apart, then yes, I wouldn't have anywhere to go and anywhere to live. Like this is all to say, I knew I was super, super, super privileged and I had a lot going for me. And it would be actually pretty difficult for me, Paul Richards at the time, to fall into homelessness. But I think what you're getting at, Karen, I think her larger point that I missed as a dumb 18-year-old is you can't put your faith in your money or your status or your power in this world that Kohelet is trying to get at. And this is really where we see the faithfulness of Kohelet, even as he may not be like really beating you over the head trying to believe in God. But I think he's trying to say at the end of the day, like, this world is full of chances and random things that happen, and you can't really count on it. And God kind of works in mysterious ways, but also at the end of the day, God is the only one we can trust. God is the thing that is consistent and desirable. Like, yes, taxes are always there, but like, it's good that it's good that we have taxes and that we have this way of like having roads and fire department or whatever. But like God is that consistent thing that we know we can trust. So at the end of the day, like God is where we put our faith, for Kohelet at least.
Mm-hmm. So this is also the question that we leave you with to ponder over this next week. Where do you place your trust? And as you go over this, I would invite you to do it in a way that is not really shameful. Kohelet has a lot of strong opinions, and Paul and I also have a lot of strong opinions. And ultimately, we are all shaped by this, again, bonkers world. And we all have so many different life experiences and relationships and ways that we have had to cope to survive. So recognize all of that as you're examining where you place your trust, and just name it to yourself, just acknowledge it, and see where that leads you.
And Karen, I think your wisdom about not being shameful about it, I think it can be really powerful if you have some really close relationships. I hope at St. Paul's you have some really close relationships where there are people who you feel you can be really open and vulnerable with, and that they can be non-judgmental. It's like if you start to feel like, oh, like I have not been putting my trust in God because I've been X, Y, and Z, like those feelings should not be borne by yourself. Like I really hope that in the St. Paul's community, you can find people who are like, can be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you said that because I've been feeling the same thing. And this is what the church is for us to support one another, so that we can all grow closer to God as we grow closer to one another. So.
Yeah. As one of your pastors, throughout the ordination process, we have this residency period. And one of my primary growth goals that I pinpointed for myself and that I asked the various teams who were working with me to help me with and keep me accountable for was trust in God. So that was one of my growth goals for my residency period before ordination. And it continues to be a struggle for everyone in faith, which is why it is faith.
Well, Thank you, everybody, for continuing to journey with us with Kohelet. Correct me if I'm wrong, Karen, we have 2 more sections left. 2 more.
That is correct. We have the 17th and the 24th finishing up right before Holy Week kicks off.
So we will see you all next week.
See you then. Bye.